Nope. Looks like we're live. Hello,
Nice.
everybody. We're gonna give it a few minutes to get started, but welcome to the vCluster office hours. Mike Peterson. I'm here with Tomas. Um, I say Tomas, but it's probably Thomas, right? Like every time I say
It's
Tomas,
fine. You
like
can pronounce it however you want. I am
make it
very
special.
relaxed about it. You can if you give me a completely different name as long as I know that I'm supposed to be that person. You can call me Daniel, whatever. No, we already
Like
have a Daniel. David. We also have
Tomas.
a David. Perfectly fine. That works as well.
And how do you pronounce your last name
Oh,
without doing it wrong?
Koszewski. That's like the Polish
Because
version.
I would not have said it that way.
Koszewski.
Oh
Yeah,
man.
you need to pronounce it with a light S. Koszewski.
How's it going, Ranganath? We've got someone who has joined and said hello, hello. We'll get
Oh,
started
hello
here in a
from
minute.
Edinburgh. How's the weather? The UK weather.
Is it cold and rainy? I feel like anywhere like this far north is just cold and rainy. That's like
Like
Seattle,
everywhere.
Portland. Yeah. Amsterdam was just cold and
It
rainy.
was horrible. Like whenever we just went out of and during Amsterdam, it was like rain, rain, rain. I just remember we were doing this city rally, and look. I still have got this little shitty thing from this Amsterdam city race that we did with like those locks and picking them open and this challenge. I still have that thing, but it was pouring rain and I was soaking wet. And at some point, I just didn't want to stay in the rain. So instead of solving the challenges and getting the codes, I just started lock picking those locks and trying out thousands of combinations until they open. And two or three out of those six locks I got open that way. And then we just solved the rest and we just went and hid in the challenge room of that thingy. It was
Gotcha.
great.
I'll say, speaking of that too, like we've got Paris coming up. Is it going to be rainy in March? I guess there too, or is it going to be at least like nice? I don't think I've ever been there in March. I've been there like in the fall.
I haven't been to Paris at all.
Oh, okay. Well, then you don't know. There you go. All right. So it looks like we got the people have joined. Let's go ahead and get started then. So we'll do some reintroductions and everything. So January 30th, vCluster office hours. I'll let Tomas introduce himself first, and then I'll introduce myself. So
Mhm.
Tomas.
Hey, I'm Thomas. I'm a senior software engineer at Loft, dealing mostly with vCluster with vCluster Pro, Pro Distro, and Loft itself.
So when someone opens an issue, you see it, and then you're like, oh, maybe I can fix this, and then you go and add new features or make fixes or something like that. So we have a real
Yes,
software dev. All right.
basically.
I'm Mike. Sorry, I'm Mike Peterson. I'm a technical marketing engineer, background engineering, but not software dev, more systems. But let's go ahead and get going on this vCluster office hours. So here's our agenda. So we did our intro. The theme for this is what happens after you go through our getting started guide. So you've heard about vCluster, you've messed around with it, you've created a vCluster, it's port forwarding, and you're like, oh, this is awesome. I don't want to port forward anymore. What do I do next? Um, so before we get started with that, let me go ahead and also plug our community survey. So if you're using vCluster and you're running into any issues, or you just got started with it and you have some feedback, here is a link to our community survey. Now, this is going to be recorded and it's going to be on our YouTube channel if you need to come back and find this later. But please, oh, posted there too. Thank you so much. If you get a chance, go here, fill this out. You get some vCluster Pro credits. That's the Pro product, Enterprise. That's going to give you a UI and a bunch of other awesome features that make it so you can get started a little bit faster. But yeah, please go fill this out. This is about the OSS version, so open source, and we want as much feedback as we can get to figure out like what kind of new features to add, what kind of content to make the journey easier from getting started to actually using it in production and POCs. So let's go ahead and get started with what to do after getting started. So we're going to cover a couple of things. We're going to cover how to get your KubeConfig, or what do you do to get your KubeConfig so that you can automate that process if you're using something like Argo CD, or you just want to send it to your users. How do you set up Ingress, right? After doing port forwarding, you want to move to Ingress, or a better way to access the vCluster instead of port forwarding all the time. That way you can hand that out to your users and they can just connect to it. We're talking about CRDs, and then we're going to talk about some POC use cases. So starting out with KubeConfig, I'm going to go ahead and talk for a minute, and then I'll ask Thomas some questions and see what kind of feedback he has. We recently did a video on this. If you're interested in how to get it, just check out our YouTube channel. So how do you get the KubeConfig after you deployed it to the cluster? So how was the first time? How did you do it for the first time, Thomas? Did you use the vCluster CLI? Like, how would you automate it for a user? What's the best way to do it? Is it to go into the secret and pull it out? Like, what would you do?
Well, it depends on your use case. Me personally, I just prefer the CLI because it's much simpler. You just have one command or two and it just works. Of course, if you're looking for more integrated ways, you can do the secret. Personally, I just do the CLI and I don't really mind about the things happening in the background.
So that would just require you to at least install the vCluster CLI, which adds a lot of
Yes.
functions around creating the virtual cluster and
Yes.
working with it. Okay, cool. So yeah, so install the vCluster CLI if you can. If you can't do that and you're doing everything through kubectl, there are ways to get it still through that. Like I said, there's a video on it. This one's kind of short because this is immediately after you've installed it. Like, how do I get that kubeconfig? How do I access it? vCluster CLI or in the secret. So what would you want to automate it for besides like Argo CD or self-service, you think? Is there any other reasons to automate it? Like grabbing it is probably the best use cases. Give my users information, give Argo CD user information so it can connect.
Yeah, I mean, probably also if you want to do some kind of weird uh, GitHub Actions runner or GitLab runners or whatever, you can probably just automate it, plug that into the controller for that thing, and then it can spin up those runners without needing to have cluster role permissions or anything else that it needs outside of its namespace. So that could also work if you want to automate that kind of things.
All right, this is the easy one. This is right after you get started. You want to do this. All right, so let's go ahead to something that's can take a little bit more time to talk about, Ingress. Okay, so depending on your Ingress controller, most of our stuff is around Nginx, but there are many Ingress controllers you could be using. We've got videos on that, and we've also got some guides on how to get that set up. But so how would you usually, for you, if you're like setting up for a customer or something like that, what would you do after you first set up Ingress, right? Like, are there some special things you have to do to get it to work? Maybe SSL pass through. What do you do when a user's like, hey, how do I set this up? Or if they have a question.
Well, as every good lawyer says, it depends. Well, obviously the first thing is about what Ingress controller you're going to be running with. We're using Nginx because it's one of the most popular ones. But at the end of the day, it will work with everyone because Kubernetes, like any other REST application, it's basically just plain HTTP requests that just go in and go out. And what you do with the Ingress controller in this case is to basically just proxy those things from outside the world to the vCluster pod. So at the end of the day, it depends. If you have full control over your Ingress controller, we basically tell you just do SSL pass-through, then you have the best and cleanest solution because you never have to mess with certificates. And what you get as output from the CLI is going to be perfectly fine. And you can be sure that it's end-to-end secure because the moment you get from external world to vCluster, the vCluster terminates TLS and everything is nice and dandy. If you don't have control over that, because for example, you're at a company that has namespace as a service, you obviously cannot do that, and you need to start doing the ways around it, where you basically configure TLS service alternative names, and you do that kind of things, either through CLI or through Helm values and whatnot. And then you have to specify Helm or an Ingress where you actually terminate TLS at the Ingress, and then it gets proxied forward, and need to do a bit of insecure flags and what's not. But you can also do the load balancer.
So we're doing that kind of stuff maybe with like the enterprise solution, right? Like we're kind of taking care of some of that for you. So where it's like it's different installing the pro versus that. Like, so you say SSL pass through and stuff. It's still like one of the questions we got from the community was, is it still secure, right? Like, and it is because it's still terminating before it gets there, and then it's just passing traffic through to K3s, right? So is there a reason why we have to use SSL pass through, like you're saying, like that's, or is there you have to do all this?
So technically, there's little to no difference if you terminate it at the Ingress or at the K3s container, because assuming that you trust your Ingress and the network within your Kubernetes cluster, if TLS is terminated in the Ingress and it goes to the container, it should be the same as if the TLS wouldn't be terminated at the Ingress and it would just go directly to the container. At the end of the day, you still have TLS, you will still have secure communication from the outside world to your cluster. The question only just becomes how locked down and how tightly you need it. If you cannot trust your Ingress at all, you probably won't be able to do any kind of TLS termination at the Ingress whatsoever, because then it wouldn't make sense to terminate at Ingress for your backend application, but not for vCluster.
If anybody has any questions too, feel free to ask questions. Like we'll answer them. We're just going to kind of talk about the topics, but then we'll answer questions about them too. We kind of skipped a step. Like the step in between port forwarding and this might be just setting up a load balancer. But the idea is if you're going to be setting up multiple virtual clusters, you want to skip that just load balancer for each virtual cluster, and you want to get into using Ingress. So you can have a single load balancer and you can send that traffic to multiple different virtual clusters based on the host name. So you might go, You might go like port forwarding. Oh, I can use the expose option when I'm creating a virtual cluster, and that'll give me a load balancer. And then you go to, one load balancer per, because that's going to save you a ton of money, especially if you're going through like AWS or something like that. You just create your Ingress controller, you get your load balancer address, and then you start setting up your host names at point there. And then with the Ingress resource, you define the host name.
To be fair,
All right,
if you're also starting off, you can also just provision 5 load balancers, pay for that. And if at some point you realize you want to continue running with vCluster and want to optimize the costs, you can either look into migrating to Ingress to save costs, or going to the commercial side of things where we are even doing auto sleep mode and what's not to even optimize further on the costs. So probably the easiest one is just get it out with load balancer, have perfect end-to-end MTLS, whatever, and then it just works out of the box.
I'll say once you get used to using load balancers Ingress, you're using it for everything for the most part too.
Yeah.
So like all of your apps and stuff are sitting there. Now that's probably one of the hardest things that people hit when they get used to Kubernetes is like, how does this Ingress stuff work? Because it's just like, it's not as hard as it used to be where you're setting up an Nginx configuration file like on a server and then doing it all by hand or something like that, or using like Chef or something to automate it back in the day. Now it's the same thing. You can go in and look at the Nginx configuration file and see it's basically doing the same thing. So all this stuff just matches what happened like 10 years ago. It's more automated and you have less visibility unless you know where to look.
Yeah, it's basically reverse proxy with additional steps.
So let's talk about CRDs then. We'll move on to the next topic. So this is something that we also hear is like, should I install? Now this is probably more long-winded from Thomas. I'm going to give him some good questions. Do I install my CRDs in my virtual cluster, or do I install them on the host cluster? All right, hold on. So I'll finish out this thought, and then we'll come back to it. We'll answer this question. Do I install on the host cluster? Do I install on the virtual cluster? And I'll expand on that in a second. But we have a question. So can we install Traffic Hub on vCluster for all the load balancer functionality? Can we run GitHub CI pipelines and Octopus deploy pipelines on different vClusters?
So regarding the Traffic Hub, if I recall correctly, Traffic Hub is the SaaS service offered by Traffic that allows you to tunnel into your Kubernetes cluster from the outside when you, it's basically like Cloudflare tunnels and ngrok and what's not, if I recall correctly. Technically, you can do that because what Traffic is internally doing is they're spinning up tunnels that are then connecting to the outside world, and provide you with a publicly accessible endpoint. And all of those things are tracked on the Kubernetes API server layer. So yes, you can spin up a Traffic Hub within a vCluster, and technically, it should still be able to provision load balancers and update the load balancer addresses and what's not. And everything should work as expected.
So that's the question. Do you install that on the base cluster and then just expose that with resources internally there, or would you put that in the virtual cluster?
You
like
can
in
do
each
both.
cluster?
It
Okay.
depends on your use case. So you could do it on the host cluster if you want to share it across multiple tenants. If you want to just have it in this one vCluster, you could install it just in this one vCluster.
Makes sense.
And
Awesome.
regarding the
Hopefully
second question with running GitHub CI pipelines and Octopus deploy pipelines in different vClusters, I don't know about Octopus deploy, but with GitHub CI and GitHub Actions, you can very well reuse our GitHub action for spinning up and destroying vClusters from a pipeline. So for instance, in GitHub Action, you could just create a kind cluster, and within this kind cluster, you can then create a vCluster and run stuff in there. Or you can download a kubeconfig that is from your GKE, EKS, AKS cluster, and then create a cluster using the vCluster CLI, for example, or the GitHub action.
Awesome. Or so you're just like using the same Helm chart, you might modify that, and then you're deploying the virtual cluster.
Yes.
Okay. Awesome. All right. So let's go back to CRDs because it kind of hit that. So, should I install CRDs on the vCluster? And you say it depends, right? Like, but what CRDs should you? We'll start with that. Should you deploy on the vCluster instead of on the base cluster? And then we'll go. What should you deploy only on the base cluster and share up?
That's a great question. That's a religious question.
Yeah.
What
would you
a
do?
question of faith. Yeah. Well, it depends. So let's say you've got something like Cert Manager, or you've got things that are mostly idling a lot of the time. You probably don't want to have the same thing redeployed 100,000 times. But 100,000, but over exaggerated, but maybe 100 times. Let's say you have 100 tenants. You don't want to have FluentD running or FluentBit or Vector, any kind of other streaming application, log streaming application running in each and every vCluster, because that would just be redundant. You would have the same configs, you would be streaming to the same Datadog endpoint or Elasticsearch or Loki. And it would just be idling most of the time. So you would be just wasting compute and resources. So for example, when you're using something like a Prometheus scraper or the Fluent bit operator, Fluenty operator, I don't recall properly anymore. It probably makes sense to just put that into the host cluster because especially with Prometheus, makes it's just much easier to have a Prometheus rule CRD that syncs into your host cluster, and then in the host cluster, Prometheus just scrapes it, and you have a platform team, and they just have one big Prometheus instance or manage Prometheus or Victoria Metrics or Cortex or Thanos or whatever's out there. So like that's great. But then there are situations where you just want to run the CRD yourself. So a great example for that is, let's say, the Gateway API, because we were just on the topic of Ingress. So the Gateway API is like the next step of Ingress, but it's not a core Kubernetes resource, but it's a CRD that you need to install additionally. So maybe you or your development team is ready to start adopting the Gateway API, but another team isn't. So in that case, it doesn't make sense to install this one fixed CRD in the host cluster and force everybody to use the same CRD, but it just makes sense to say, look, if you're ready to use Gateway API, just install it in your vCluster and use it from within that. And then it can work. And then you can gradually start building on top of that. And you can say, okay, so now we're going to start putting the gateway into our host cluster, but you still have your HTTP route and your other resources in your vCluster. So at the end of the day, you can also just do a mix between the two when you as an organization or you as team are ready. And you just get the freedom to mix and match whatever makes sense and whatever you need. Because let's say you also want to run a newer Prometheus version, then it doesn't make sense to have it synced into the host cluster when you just want to have a newer operator version. It just makes sense to basically say, all right, we're just going to roll our own thing. We're not going to be syncing anymore. We'll just do it ourselves.
So what are the gotchas on that? When do you run into issues? Like how far ahead is it if the specs
Mhm.
get changed in a version that you're running on vCluster that's ahead of
Mhm.
what's on the base cluster, like is that going to cause issues, right? Because it doesn't know how to reconcile it because maybe it has something in a different spot or
Yeah, so those issues can exist. And you'll probably run into issues. Let's say you want to run a newer version of some kind of operator. You'll run into the problem that if your CRD and the vCluster is a newer version and you try to sync it, or you have been running with an operator within the vCluster with a newer version that the CRD is in the host cluster, you might get into some data corruption, validation issues because suddenly you might have fields with a different name or with different values or a completely different structure of the CRD. Those things can also happen between, let's say, V1 alpha 1 and V1 beta 1. So you might end up with a manifest that isn't compatible with the host cluster, and then the syncing process would effectively break, and you wouldn't be able to synchronize those things anymore. And that's basically one of the problems with CRDs, that once you have a CRD, everybody is forced to use the same CRD and the same version and the same values, so to say. So it like really depends once you want to go from this self-hosted CRD to a shared CRD.
it's also a feature, right? Like say instead of having to deploy a whole other cluster and deploy your entire application on top of it, you can deploy a vCluster with that new version of the CRD and see what breaks to see what you need to update
Oh yeah, absolutely.
your configuration.
That's also great when you're developing cloud native applications that depend on, let's say, the Kubernetes API. Because more often than not, when you're writing something like a Kubernetes operator or you're building on top of Kubernetes with additional platform features and whatnot, you might not always have the time to spin up a entire air-gapped EKS cluster. And I'm talking about air-gapped EKS because I just had to deal with it again, and it's a lot of fun. You get to configure everything, which is nice, but it also takes a lot of time. And when you, for example, have already this super tight and secure and what's not set up where you're doing those things, it's just much easier to just say, all right, vCluster create, and you have a subcluster where everything is just working in this air-gapped environment. And then you can just test your application, because maybe your application was working with Kubernetes 126, but in 129, something changed regarding an API that you're using, like config map access, or let's say Kubernetes leases, because you can do leader election or token review APIs, or any other feature that you might be integrating into your application that's running on top of Kubernetes. You can just test drive it within a vCluster in your, let's say, production-like environment without having to actually spin up a production-like environment, because you can just reuse those pre-existing environments that you have for testing and validation.
All right, what's easier right now? Installing a CRD into vCluster or syncing from the host cluster and giving access to it, right? Like we've got the generic CRD syncer, and then we've got another thing that's in beta that's going to sync stuff. what's more common, do you think? Are people just installing another CRD in the vCluster, or are they sharing it up?
I personally think it's easier to install it in the vCluster because it's just a
Okay,
kubectl apply, and you
awesome.
don't have to read docs. So that's another thing.
So I think we kind of came to the point that like if you want to run something 100, if you don't want to run something 100 times, maybe install it in the host cluster and share it up. If you've got people that aren't going to use it, and say you only need it for one project or maybe 10 out of 100 projects, maybe install it in the vCluster. There also comes to the point of like if you're doing it in the host cluster and it's something like cert manager and you've got the cluster issuer on the host cluster, that's information that you have to share with your users. So depending on what kind of multi-tenancy you have set up, you might not want to have to share what cluster issuer that they're going to use unless it's like a generic thing for docs, because then everyone's using the same thing. But if they install it in their own virtual cluster, they can manage their own issuers and cluster issuers and all that stuff, and it's not getting certificates created based on maybe a single email address too, right? Like maybe that's another
Mhm.
thing, is another email address gets added into the Let's Encrypt configuration.
Yeah,
Um,
the other thing is you might also be a platform operator and you have a HashiCorp Vault running somewhere and Cert Manager supports Vault. You might not want to recreate 100 access keys or tokens for each and every tenant you have just for certificates when only you can generate them. And then you have one token that you need to take care of, or Kubernetes authentication, any kind of other auth method that you're using. And it just works, and you just maintain this one thing and it works for everyone.
all right, so Istio base cluster install, right? Some people installing, but yeah, there's the hardest one. Istio is something that we need to address next and figure out some documentation on. Like, do I install that on the host cluster? Do I install that in the vCluster? Well, in the host cluster, I think it makes more sense on the host cluster, but I don't know because I'm not doing it in production, right? Like maybe not, because it's going to add the sidebars and stuff like that. Maybe the users aren't going to end up seeing that at all because it's not going to get shared up, but you'll be able to see it as the admin, right? So they don't know what's happening, but you're just doing stuff that way. Yeah, I don't know. So like you said, it depends on what your use case is, what you need, how large uh the multi-tenancy is, and if it's production, like if it's real customers or if it's just developers or users, and how much information you're willing to share. All right, let's see. What's the next one? The next one is going to be POC use cases, and I put my thing that I
Oh
created
yeah.
on here just because. All right, so we'll talk about a couple of POC use cases that we've seen, and then if anyone has any POC or use cases that they're using it for, we'd definitely be interested in hearing about that. Or if you have any questions on like what you should start with, we hear a lot of the time like, is this production ready? Right? Like people are using it in production. It is being used in production. People are using KubeVirt in production like way before it hit like 1.02. So like it is a little bit kind of wild out there. People are using things before they hit like 1.0, but I think a lot of the feature sets that are added in before that are pretty much production ready, and there's not a lot of like, I don't know, like gotchas that are crazy out there if you test and you use it. So let's see. The ones we usually hear are, dev test preview. So what are those, Thomas? I can stop talking for a minute.
Oh yeah, no, it's great. Uh, yeah, so dev test preview is basically you have a PR open in GitHub or some other environment, and instead of having to recreate the environment, you can just have a GitHub action that says, "All right, I'm spinning up this vCluster, adding it to Argo CD," and suddenly you have an entire preview environment where you can test out your application, make a change to the UI, preview environment spits up, somebody can test it out, everything works as expected, and can be gone again. Or sometimes you can also have something where it's a customer-facing bug that they were facing. You can fix it, create a preview environment and a pipeline, hand it out to them, ask them if it happens again. If it doesn't, you merge it, ship it to everyone. Congrats. So that's one of the things that we have seen and that also we're doing, especially with like vCluster Pro and Loft and then our internal things. We just spin up preview environments for every change that we do so that we can always just reproduce it, test it, look at the logs without having to necessarily fork and run those things locally.
And if you're here and you haven't really used vCluster much and you're just kind of interested, what would I use this for? The time it takes to deploy a vCluster for any of these use cases where you don't want to just spin up another cluster every time a developer needs access, right? Like that's the meme. Um, you can go from saying, okay, explain to me why your team needs a Kubernetes cluster. This is a very expensive. You need like 3 to 4 hosts, and you need like all this stuff and another load balancer. I'm going to pay for that monthly. To let me just share the main cluster that we have with all of your team, and then we'll give you virtual clusters for each one of those, and then we can set up different quotas and things so that you can have a certain amount of the cluster, and then you're getting back to like, cutting up a cluster into like what virtualization was. You're maybe oversubscribing people to it and just basing it on like how much time they're going to use it, and saving money and getting more usage out of your cluster, maybe like 70 or 80%. I don't know if it's really that high of a number. Like I don't have numbers to back this up, but you're shooting for more like 70 to 80% usage instead of just like I've deployed this 3 node cluster for somebody that's working on an open source project, and they're just like deploying their testing and seeing if it works, and it's like just sitting there forever.
Yeah, you
And
can also
costing
go the carpenter ways if you like on EKS, because carpenter is like this smart smart node provisioner cluster autoscaler replacement where you don't work with target groups but just directly add those instances. So especially with like test and preview environments and clusters for tenants, etc., you don't even need to care about provisioning those instances. They will just come in the moment that you need them for the compute that you need, and it does auto reconciliation and what's not. So more often than not, you can just spin up a vCluster. Somebody can deploy whatever they want, and the infrastructure just magically appears out of thin air.
And when they mess it up, they just delete it. They
Yeah, you
fix
just delete the namespace and everything is fine
Yeah.
again.
Hey, like it makes, I guess, making a little button like redeploy this for me and like destroy everything and redeploy a lot easier, and it makes it a lot less nerve wracking, I think, for people that aren't used to it and that are just getting into Kubernetes, worrying that they're going to mess something up if they just know that they can just destroy it and start again. Like it's
Yeah, and I think that's also a good practice, because if you
yeah.
learn that you should destroy those things, you don't get into this fallacy or this issue where you start editing things in place in your Kubernetes cluster using kubectl edit or something else, and then you don't even know anymore what you put into the cluster, and then you need to recreate it and it doesn't work. So it's also kind of forcing you into getting into this GitOps kind of area where you put everything into your manifest files and then you reapply those, or use Argo CD or Flux or anything else. So it's sort of pushing you more into this, let's say, conventional way of doing things.
It's going back to the good old days of restart the computer if you have a problem instead of trying to troubleshoot and fix it because you're wasting time. You might as well just like restart it and get it going again.
Oh yeah,
Although I'm sure you'd enjoy, trying to figure out what the actual root cause is instead.
absolutely not. And I've gotten to the point in my life where I don't even care why something broke. I'm just happy it works again.
Yeah. All right, cool. So then let's say production, right? Like so moving to production, there are people using it in production. Like it's getting used for production multi-tenancy. So that's one of the things I put on here. And then the difference for another one, production multi-tenancy with GPUs. The difference between those being like some of these are just using it to give applications to people, right? Like so that you're splitting up an EKS cluster, and depending on your customer's data needs, right? Like you might be able to just kind of split it up and give them a cheaper cost for the application hosted with other people, but you still have security and you can still manage like who can access what. I think that's one of the most common use cases that we saw until NVIDIA and put out the new drivers to where you can do fractional GPUs, right? Until that happened, it was like 1 GPU per single pod on an entire cluster, which wasn't very useful for multi-tenancy. But so back to regular multi-tenancy, what kind of use cases do you see for multi-tenancy out in production? Kind of like, I guess, CodeFresh and some of the others.
Yeah, I think it makes the design pattern for multi-tenancy applications much easier, because you don't need to suddenly start thinking about writing an application that is connecting to multiple databases, because previously you maybe had to do that where you have physical databases that are separated and your application is suddenly connecting to 20, 50, 100 databases. Or you need to do manual sharding or namespaces per user, per what's not. Because right now you can just think of your application as a multi-tenant application. And if you have somebody who wants to have a separate tenant, you just spin up a vCluster and deploy the same application. So you can have one that's called a SaaS version, where you have tenants that are separated within your application. And if they want to have a hard separation, you just spin up a vCluster and you give them a subdomain. And that also works. So it makes it much easier to take your, let's say, SaaS application that is built on top of Kubernetes and just make it multi-tenant out of the box with strict and hard separation of data and everything else. Which even then allows you to be more compliant with, let's say, SOC 2 or those other certifications and requirements that you might have, because it just makes it much less cumbersome to think about multi-tenancy, because you just spin up another thing. It's like previously we had it with databases, right? When you have a Postgres, what a lot of people are forgetting, Postgres isn't a database, it's a database management system, right? You can have within a Postgres, you can have multiple databases that are still running within this one Postgres application, but there's like separate entities that don't share any permission, that don't share any data or anything with each other. It's just separate things running in this one management system. And that's sort of what vCluster is also doing to Kubernetes and like those multi-tenant applications that are running in production. You, at the end of the day, have got this one management system, and the vCluster is just a database within this management system.
Awesome. Yeah. So let's talk about, I guess, GPU. So like this, it just looks like the same thing from above, but like this is what's kind of exciting, especially from like the last KubeCon, hearing all these other vendors and stuff are popping up around this, the ability to do fractional
Mhm.
GPUs and split it up, right? I mean, previously you could have done that with something like pass-through, right? Like I don't know,
Mhm.
did pass-through do like network functions type deal with GPUs previously with like KubeVirt is what you would use, I guess, on there. But now you just have the driver automatic,
Mhm.
not automatically, but you have to get the driver. You can install the driver and you can set it up to where, say your users are doing like data science or something like that, or they're just using Jupyter notebooks, or they're actually doing
Mhm.
some actual like training or something like that. You can give them access to a GPU. You can set up different quotas and make sure that they're only like use a certain amount. Uh, vCluster makes that awesome because instead of just doing it namespace based, you can give them their own virtual cluster. They can access it and set up their own namespaces, applications, and stuff in there, and think that they have their own cluster and they have a partition of that GPU. So, have you seen anything exciting around that? You know, building up besides like I think like one of the companies doing that is like CoreWeave, but then there's I think a bunch of other companies that are probably gonna be popping up over the next like 12 months doing this. Well, even Nvidia's kind of doing it now too. Like they've got their own, I think, cloud native cloud stuff that's doing. I don't know if they're using like Knative or something. They're doing the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, that's what makes the most sense because even if you start buying those A100 GPUs, those are expensive as heck. So you want to maximize the usage of those. So if you have some of those on-prem, it probably just makes the most sense to fractionalize them, just like we did with massive hypervisors in the past, and just try to maximize the usage out of it, even overcommit and what's not. Because a lot of the time, you're just not going to use it, and then the costs and return value are going to just decrease.
Where do you configure that? Like that, do you configure that in your Kubernetes configuration, or is it just a image that you're using as a different base image?
You
For like
mean for
your
the vCluster, or you mean within the host cluster?
within like so yeah within the host cluster, I guess you set up a configuration to have access to the GPUs. Like
Yeah.
I've done that in VMs. I haven't done that in Kubernetes. I don't know if you
Yeah,
messed around with that yet.
you need to do a couple of things. So the one thing, especially with the GPUs, is you need to install the device plugin. So
Okay.
Kubernetes introduced a couple API versions ago, something called device plugins, which are an extension to the kubelet, so to say, so that you can report additional devices to the Kubernetes control plane. So with the case of GPUs, we can report how much GPU capacity is available. So for example, VRAM. But we can also report on different things. So we can also report on network interface cards, or we can report on HSMs that are attached to a given machine or instance. And all of those things can be funneled back to the Kubernetes API server. And from there, the scheduler can then start incorporate those decisions into scheduling decisions and how to distribute your workloads. But yes, you will have to install a device plugin that is on those nodes that is reporting all of those things. And then you need to do, I think, additional scheduling policies or potentially even adjust your scheduler. But that depends
Have,
on your need if you need to go that far.
have you deployed anything on EKS that has access or something like that? Yeah, I don't think you can define EKS nodes. You have to still do that through like EC2 or something like that and configure your own Kubernetes to get that going.
I think you can actually do it already on EKS, but I
EKS,
would have to
yeah.
look into it because the last time I was clicking in the management console, I saw. Wait, let me actually look it up because I have EKS open. Um, because I think it should be possible by now to just create a new node group that is
Okay.
utilizing an NVIDIA operating system image. And based off on that, because you have a base image that is
Yeah.
for GPUs, you should be using GPU instances out of the
Well, I
box.
mean,
But
this is
we can
interesting to me. I'm
check.
hoping it's interesting to other people that are watching too. Like this seems like fun. Like this is going to be pretty cool to give access to these, so you're not just trying to figure out how to sequence time for different groups. Like if all the groups just want to do it at the same time, especially if basically every company seems, especially like retail and other things, are doing data science, and they're starting to try to look at information, especially after some of the bigger ones posted how they're doing everything like in real time, figuring out like what they need to produce. There's a company, one of the biggest clothing companies that wrote an article recently about how they use like real-time analytics to figure out like what they should produce, and they're doing like on demand instead of just having like a backlog of clothing, like fast
Yeah.
fashion stuff.
So I just looked it up. You can add GPU enabled EC2
Okay.
instances to your EKS cluster. So if you go through the UI or like the management console, you just select Amazon Linux 2 GPU enabled or Bottle Rocket GPU or the ARM instances, depending on that. And then you only have a selection of those instances with GPUs attached. And then you
Maybe
can just provision your workloads on top of that or subdivide them with device plugin and other APIs and then use vClusters on top of that.
maybe we should demo that sometime, and then even plug in DevPod with a Jupyter Notebook or something like that. All right,
Oh yeah.
cool. So I think we've kind of covered the POC use cases. If you have any questions or you're using it, like let us know. You can even join our Slack and let us know what you're using it for. We help answer questions when people run into problems there for vCluster. But a lot of use cases, like people are using it for home labs and stuff like that too. If they just want to segment stuff out, they're using it for dev, test, preview. It is used in production. There are companies building like entire solutions with this as like kind of the thing, kind of prop them up for multi-tenancy. So definitely something you can use in production. Let's move on to what's new and what's upcoming. So do you have anything new for us? Like, can you talk about anything that's upcoming in the open source version, or anything you're excited about or thinking about that you might start
Oh
working
yeah.
on?
Yeah, there's like two things.
Okay.
Well, let me just check the PR so that I don't spoil anything.
Okay.
Yeah, I need to go into the merge PRs to actually look it up. Okay. So we're having a bit of cleanup regarding the Helm charts that we have for the vClusters. We have started refactoring those and moving a couple of fields around, but it's in a non-breaking way, so that if you're still using the old notation, it's still going to work. And we're going to internally just move things around. So there's like things like removing an unused no arcs field or moving replicas around. So there's a bunch of cleanup. We also have started moving the embedded XD into Kubernetes itself, to the Kubernetes distro. So it's not going to be a K3s only feature, but it's going to now get propagated into more and more distros. And then there is also something new lined up regarding the vCluster plugins. There's going to be a new version of those that are going to be built on top of the I think HashiCorp plugin system for Go, so that the plugins themselves will not be running as a sidecar container anymore, but will be preloaded within an init image, and then we will just run them as a sub process of the actual Syncer application, so that you don't need to run multiple containers side by side, and everything is running within one container and process.
What is a vCluster plugin for those that are new? Like, is that like adding extra things on top of it? Is it like
Yeah,
CRD
so
syncing?
yeah, so initially the CRD syncing that we had was built within vCluster plugins, and the goal or the benefit of those vCluster plugins is that you can add additional behavior into vCluster and into the syncer without having to have it be pushed into the vCluster in tree code itself. So for example, if you're using something like Contour or Cert Manager, or want to have a very specific syncing behavior when you are moving resources between host cluster and vCluster, or host cluster into vCluster, you can just write your own plugin and have the code do the specific thing that you need from within the syncer without having to write scripts around it or controllers outside and what's not.
So you could like maybe like rename nodes and stuff like that if you want to expose like the nodes to the vCluster or something else. Maybe rename other objects. Like what's one of the
Yeah.
most common things you think you would do?
So one thing that I've seen is for example, a secret sync from the host cluster to the vCluster. That's something that we're currently not doing within vCluster itself, but you can achieve that with a plugin. You can have a Cert Manager plugin. You can have a Knative plugin where you're, for example, syncing resources between those clusters and updating states. You can also have additional plugins that are handling specific edge cases that you might be facing. So you mentioned KubeVirt. If you have a very specific scenario, for example, you want to have an alert sent out to a Slack channel when somebody creates a KubeVirt VM, you probably would do that utilizing a vCluster plugin, because you would get notified within this plugin when a sync is happening, and then you can do things around it, or you can modify it, or you can run additional admission checks within the plugin itself before it even reaches the host cluster.
Awesome. All right. So I think we'll go to Q&A. If anyone has any questions, like each time we do one of these, we're going to try to have some time for questions and answers too. So if you have any questions, let us know. I'll give you like a minute or two. We'll talk about something else while we're seeing if anything gets queued up. But definitely these are supposed to be like a Q&A too. If you run into issues, or if you want to know how something works, or if you just have feedback, definitely interested in hearing it. So, all right. So what can we talk about then? What do you want to talk about, Thomas? What's interesting about vCluster lately that you've seen that's the most interesting thing? Like, have you done any POCs or have you been messing around with like home lab or doing anything else beyond like developing on vCluster?
There's a lot of things. Need to find out what I'm supposed to talk about.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, that's a good question point.
that's like the most complicated thing. Like, I don't want to get fired. I have an NDA signed. No, I'm
Yeah.
just kidding.
Sure.
No, I think there's a lot of exciting things, and especially in the Kubernetes realm, where we suddenly have got this, I would say, moment of realization where it's like, Kubernetes is great, but we now need to do meta things, things that are on top and what's on it. And it's more like the entire Kubernetes realm has shifted from let's move everything onto Kubernetes and be like, let's move everything on top of Kubernetes within Kubernetes. And it's like, let's automate all of those things. And like, let's get all of those things straight. Um, and that's sort of like where I see vCluster, because almost every use case that is like out there, if it's like production multi-tenancy or something like that, it's like, yeah, so we developed it cloud first, and then we had the problem with 10,000 clusters and managing them, and now we just consolidate it in one. It's like, yeah, I could have done it earlier. Or there's a lot of talks that I've also seen lined up for KubeCon, where it's like, and this is how we use Kyverno to add policies so that somebody cannot delete two namespaces in our cluster, and then we can give them a lot of admin permissions, but not all. We're oftentimes just looking at that or watching such presentations. It's like you could have just put one vCluster in there and not had to write 50 different Kyverno policies. So there's a lot of things that I'm seeing where people are doing more work than potentially necessary.
So you're saying you're swapping to Rust and WebAssembly.
Why not?
That's, what do you think
I
about
mean,
WebAssembly?
there used to be a kubelet that was running WASM,
Yeah,
and it was written in Rust, but it didn't find adoption, so they just stopped continuing the development.
gotcha. All right, well, looks like we don't have a ton of questions. I think we had some earlier on. Thank you so much for the questions earlier. Let's go ahead and move to how to get involved. Oh, yeah. We're fixing or we're updating some of the documentation and stuff too. Some of the documentation needs a little bit more guides on like how to do things, especially with things other than Nginx or things other than things that we've written about, right? Like just the base stuff. So we're working on more documentation on that. Hopefully make the journey a little bit easier to go from start to finish with vCluster. But if you want to get involved, maybe some of the low-hanging fruit would be just updating some documentation if you're interested in getting like a PR or something like that. But you can check out our GitHub, join our Slack. That's in our chat here too. Our docs are here, and then here's all of our social information. But yeah, if you want to get involved, you can do that. If you just have questions and you want to get answers, just join our Slack and then ask in the vCluster channel. You can also, like, if you have a question that maybe would be something that's common that comes up, it'd be better probably have it on the GitHub issues just so that people can search for answers instead of a Slack channel if they run the same thing. I've done that a couple times when I was running into problems with vCluster and had to reread stuff that I've read like 6 months ago that I had forgotten about, like the SSL pass through, right? Like that that was one thing I had to re-find out after spending like an hour or two being like, why isn't this working? I've got my cert, I've got everything set up. Why isn't this working? And I just had to enable it correctly. But
Yeah,
there's
I'll
our
let you
social
in on a
stuff.
secret. I have to look up the docs every single time I want to do something.
Yeah. So
Like, I forgot the
why
things.
remember it? It's there. All
Yeah,
right.
but the other thing is, it's also great because you go back to the docs and you're like, this doesn't work anymore. I need to fix it. So you just
Yes.
revalidate it. So that's why I don't remember.
That's where most of my commits are, is going through and having to read a document page where I have to fix something or work on it. Like, oh, let me just add this real quick so it's easier to find, that way we're not like linking people to other sites or anything like that. But I guess thank you everyone for joining. If you want to rewatch any of this, or if you want to hear some of the great tidbits from Thomas later, you can rewatch it on YouTube. It'll be on our YouTube channel. I think we're streaming right now anyways, like immediately. But like I said, yeah, join our Slack if you have questions. We're gonna have another one of these, I believe, in March. So if you want us to talk about certain topics or something like that, let us know in the Slack channel, or reach out on LinkedIn or something else. But thank you so much for joining. I hope everyone enjoyed it and it was informative. But see everyone next time.
Thanks a lot. Bye bye.